When my father demanded $30,000 from my husband during my wedding reception, I finally said no. I thought the argument was over. I had no idea that a few minutes later, that single word would change all of our lives forever. My name is Ava Carter, and if you had asked me a few years ago what mattered most in life, I would have answered without hesitation: family. I believed family was supposed to be the one thing you could count on when everything else fell apart. I believed that no matter how difficult things became, the people who shared your blood would always want what was best for you. That belief shaped nearly every major decision I made throughout my life. Unfortunately, some lessons take years to learn, some take a broken heart, and some cost far more than that. For most of my adult life, I worked as a respiratory therapist at one of the busiest hospitals in Cincinnati. The job wasn't glamorous. Most days were long, exhausting, and emotionally draining. I regularly worked 12-hour shifts that stretched into 14. I watched people fight for their lives. I comforted families during the worst moments they would ever experience. I learned how quickly life could change. The work demanded patience, compassion, and resilience. Those same qualities became the very things my family used against me. Growing up, I was the responsible child. If something needed fixing, I fixed it. If someone needed help, I helped. If there was a sacrifice to be made, somehow I was always the one expected to make it. My younger brother Ryan was the complete opposite. Where I planned, he improvised. Where I saved, he spent. Where I accepted responsibility, he looked for someone else to blame. Yet somehow, Ryan remained the favorite. My parents never admitted it openly, but everyone could see it. When Ryan failed a college semester, it was because the professors were unfair. When he lost jobs, it was because his bosses didn't appreciate him. When he borrowed money and never paid it back, it was because life had been hard on him. There was always an excuse, always a justification, always someone else responsible for the consequences of his actions. As the years passed, I stopped expecting fairness. I told myself that every family had flaws. I convinced myself that loyalty meant accepting imperfections. What I didn't understand was that there is a difference between supporting people and allowing them to exploit you. I wouldn't learn that distinction until much later. Everything began changing when I met Ethan Brooks. I still remember the day we met. I had just finished an exhausting shift during a severe winter storm. The hospital had been overwhelmed. Staff members were running on caffeine and determination. By the time my shift ended, I felt like I could barely keep my eyes open. The roads were covered in snow. Traffic was crawling. My car refused to start in the hospital parking garage. At that moment, standing in freezing temperatures with a dead battery and a growing headache, I honestly felt like crying. That's when a stranger approached carrying a portable jump starter. He smiled and asked if I needed help. That stranger was Ethan. At first, I assumed he was another hospital employee. Later, I learned he had been visiting one of his development projects nearby and happened to park in the same garage. What started as a 10-minute conversation turned into coffee. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into a relationship unlike anything I had ever experienced. For the first time in my life, someone cared about my well-being as much as I cared about theirs. Ethan listened. He paid attention. He remembered small details. When I talked about difficult days at work, he didn't dismiss my feelings. When I was exhausted, he encouraged me to rest. When I doubted myself, he reminded me of my strengths. Most importantly, he never treated kindness as a transaction. There were no hidden conditions, no guilt, no manipulation, just genuine support. It felt unfamiliar. And that should have been my first clue about how unhealthy my family relationships actually were. 2 years after we met, Ethan proposed. The proposal wasn't extravagant. There were no helicopters or television-worthy surprises. It happened during a quiet evening overlooking the Ohio River. The city lights reflected across the water. Snow drifted gently through the air. And when Ethan asked me to marry him, I said yes before he even finished the question. I had never felt more certain about anything. For the first few weeks after our engagement, everything seemed perfect. Friends celebrated with us. Coworkers congratulated us. Even my parents appeared happy. Looking back now, I realized they weren't happy because I had found love. They were happy because they saw opportunity. At first, the requests were small. My mother needed help paying a utility bill. My father needed assistance with a vehicle repair. Ryan needed temporary support while waiting for a business deal to close. The amounts were never huge. A few $100s here, a few hundred there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that immediately raised alarms. Then the requests became larger. The emergencies became more frequent. And somehow every crisis always seemed to happen shortly after my family learned about another milestone in Ethan's growing business success. The pattern was obvious. Unfortunately, I refused to see it. One evening, roughly 3 months after my engagement, I arrived home after work to find 6 missed calls from my mother. That alone was unusual. When I finally returned the call, she answered on the first ring. Her voice sounded shaky, almost panicked. "Ava," she said, "thank God you called back." My stomach tightened instantly. I asked what happened. She explained that severe storm damage had affected part of their property. According to her, insurance was refusing to cover critical repairs. The costs were overwhelming. They were terrified. If the repairs weren't completed quickly, additional structural damage could occur. At least that was the story. As she spoke, I could hear my father in the background. He sounded stressed, defeated, desperate. Everything about the conversation felt genuine. I believed every word. That night, I sat with Ethan at our kitchen table and explained the situation. I hated asking for help, especially financial help. But before I even finished explaining, Ethan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Your family shouldn't have to face something like this alone." His response made me emotional. Not because of the money, because of the generosity, because helping people came naturally to him. Within days, we contributed nearly $20,000 toward what I believed were urgent repairs. My parents expressed endless gratitude. My mother cried. My father promised he would never forget our kindness. Ryan even called to thank us. At the time, I felt proud. I thought we had done something meaningful. I thought we had helped family through a difficult situation. I had no idea I had just become part of a carefully constructed lie. Several weeks passed. Life returned to normal. Wedding planning continued. Work remained busy. Everything seemed fine. Then one Saturday afternoon, I stopped by my parents' house unexpectedly. I had baked cookies earlier that morning and thought it would be nice to visit. Simple, routine, harmless. That unplanned visit changed everything. As I approached the house, I immediately noticed something strange. There were no signs of construction, no repair equipment, no contractors, no materials, nothing. Considering the massive damage I had supposedly helped pay for, the absence of activity felt odd. Still, I ignored the feeling. I walked inside using my spare key. The voices reached me before I entered the living room. My father was laughing, not nervous laughter, not stressed laughter, carefree laughter. The kind of laughter people share when they believe nobody else is listening. Then I heard Ryan speak, and what he said made my blood run cold. At least those credit card collectors finally stopped calling. The room erupted with laughter. My father answered. 20 grand well spent. The cookie tray nearly slipped from my hands. I froze. Every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't process what I was hearing. Then my father said the sentence that shattered every remaining illusion. "Good thing Ava still believes every sob story we tell her." At that moment, my entire world shifted. Everything I thought I knew suddenly looked different. And for the first time in my life, I began questioning whether the people I loved had ever truly loved me at all. For several seconds, I stood frozen in the hallway outside my parents' living room. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. The tray of cookies felt impossibly heavy in my hands. I kept hoping I had misunderstood what I heard. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe there was some detail I didn't know. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I already knew the truth. The truth was standing right in front of me. The storm damage had never existed. The emergency had been a lie, and the $20,000 Ethan and I had given them hadn't gone toward repairs. It had gone somewhere else entirely. I slowly stepped forward. The floor creaked beneath my feet. The laughter inside the room stopped instantly. 3 faces turned toward me. My father, my mother, Ryan. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The expression on their faces told me everything. Shock, guilt, panic. Not because they felt bad, because they had been caught. The cookie tray slipped from my hands and crashed onto the hardwood floor. Nobody looked at it. Nobody moved. My father recovered first. "Ava," he said, forcing a smile. "What are you doing here?" I stared at him. The question felt absurd. What was I doing there? I was standing in the home of people who had just stolen $20,000 from me and my fiancé. "What happened to the repairs?" I asked quietly. The room immediately grew tense. Ryan looked away. My mother crossed her arms. My father attempted another smile. "What repairs?" The fact that he even tried to deny it made something inside me crack. "The storm damage," I said. "The emergency repairs. The reason Ethan and I gave you $20,000. Nobody answered. I looked around the room. The silence said more than words ever could. Finally, Ryan rolled his eyes. Honestly, that hurt more than the lie itself. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't ashamed. He looked annoyed, as if I were the problem, as if I had interrupted his afternoon. "It's not a big deal," he said. I stared at him in disbelief. "Not a big deal," he shrugged. "We needed the money." My chest tightened. Needed the money, not because their home was damaged, not because they were struggling, not because they were facing a genuine emergency. They needed the money because they wanted it. My father sighed dramatically, the same performance he had used my entire life whenever he wanted sympathy. "Look," he said, "things got complicated." "No," I replied. "They got dishonest." The room went silent again. My mother's expression hardened immediately. There it was, the shift, the moment she realized guilt wouldn't work, the moment manipulation took over. "Watch your tone," she snapped. I almost laughed. They had stolen $20,000 through fraud, and somehow my tone was the issue. "You're upset over money," my mother continued. "After everything we've done for you." There it was, the familiar script. The debt I supposedly owed for existing. The invisible bill they had spent my entire life collecting. Food, clothes, a roof over my head. Every parent is expected to provide those things. Yet somehow my parents treated basic parenting like a loan that accumulated interest forever. Ryan stood up from the couch. "You act like you're better than us now." The accusation hit me like a slap, not because it was true, because it was predictable. Every time I succeeded, they accused me of arrogance. Every time I set a boundary, they called me selfish. Every time I refused to be used, they claimed I had changed. I looked directly at my brother. "You lied to me," he shrugged again. "You weren't using the money anyway." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. $20,000 represented months of work, long shifts, missed holidays, exhaustion, sacrifice. And to Ryan, it was simply available money, money that existed because someone else earned it, money he felt entitled to. My father stepped forward. "Ava, listen carefully." His voice had changed. The warmth was gone. The fake concern was gone. What remained was control, the same controlling tone I remembered from childhood. "The money is already spent." I stared at him. "What?" "It's gone." Just like that, no apology, no promise to repay it. No remorse. Simply gone. As though that ended the conversation. Something inside me finally reached its limit. Years of excuses, years of guilt, years of manipulation, years of being treated like a resource instead of a daughter. I felt all of it rising to the surface. "You owe Ethan every cent." My father laughed, actually laughed. The sound made my stomach turn. "No, sweetheart," he shook his head. "You owe us." For a moment I couldn't speak. The entitlement was unbelievable. Then again, maybe it wasn't. People who spend years taking from others eventually convince themselves they deserve it. My mother moved beside him. "A good daughter helps her family. A good family doesn't lie and steal." The words came out before I could stop them. The room exploded. My mother gasped. Ryan started yelling. My father took a threatening step toward me. The atmosphere changed instantly. Not sadness, not regret, anger, pure anger, because their scam had failed, because they had been exposed, because I wasn't behaving the way they expected. I realized something terrifying in that moment. My family never wanted honesty. They wanted obedience. As long as I obeyed, they called it love. The second I questioned them, I became the enemy. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the front door. My father shouted after me. "Ava!" I kept walking. "Ava, get back here!" I didn't stop. For the first time in my life, I refused. I drove home in complete silence. The entire ride felt surreal. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to scream. Mostly, I felt numb. When I arrived home, Ethan immediately knew something was wrong. He was sitting at the dining table reviewing project plans. The second he looked up, his expression changed. He stood up. "What happened?" I tried to answer. Instead, I burst into tears. Everything came pouring out. The fake storm damage, the stolen money, the conversation, the lies, the betrayal, all of it. Ethan listened without interrupting, without judging, without making excuses for them. When I finally finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took my hand. "Ava," he said softly, "this wasn't your fault." I looked down. For weeks I had felt responsible. Responsible for believing them. Responsible for involving Ethan. Responsible for the loss. But hearing him say those words lifted a weight from my shoulders. "I should have known." "No," he squeezed my hand. "You trusted your family." That was the problem. I trusted people who didn't deserve trust. For the next few weeks, I stopped answering most of their calls. The reduction in contact was immediate, and so was their reaction. First came the guilt trips. Then came the accusations. Then came the anger. Every voicemail sounded worse than the last. According to my parents, I had abandoned them. According to Ryan, I was destroying the family. According to all three of them, I had become selfish after meeting Ethan. The irony was almost funny. The only thing that had changed was that I finally started saying no. As the wedding approached, their behavior became increasingly strange. Desperate. Aggressive. Almost frantic. At first, I couldn't understand why. Then I learned the truth. One evening, an unfamiliar number appeared on my phone. Normally, I ignored unknown calls. For some reason, I answered. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a financial investigator. What he told me sent a chill through my entire body. Ryan wasn't simply irresponsible. He wasn't merely bad with money. He was drowning in debt. Massive debt. Far larger than anyone in the family had admitted, and several creditors were actively searching for him. Suddenly everything made sense. The fake emergencies. The constant requests. The increasing desperation. The pressure. The manipulation. The lies. My family wasn't asking for money because they needed help. They were trying to keep Ryan's financial disaster from collapsing around them. And if they couldn't get money from me, they would find another way. At that moment, I had no idea how dangerous that desperation would become. But within weeks, my wedding day would arrive, and my family would make one final attempt to take control. An attempt that would change all of our lives forever. The weeks leading up to my wedding should have been some of the happiest of my life, but instead, they became a slow and painful lesson in how far desperate people are willing to go when they believe someone owes them access to another person's success. After learning the truth about Ryan's financial situation, I started looking back at the previous 2 years through an entirely different lens. Every emergency, every emotional phone call, every crisis that seemed to appear out of nowhere suddenly made sense. My family had not been struggling with bad luck. They had been struggling with the consequences of Ryan's choices, and rather than forcing him to face those consequences, they had turned me into their solution. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. What hurt wasn't the money itself. Ethan and I were fortunate enough to recover financially. What hurt was realizing that the people I had spent my entire life trying to support had never once stopped to consider how their actions affected me. They saw my kindness as a resource. They saw my loyalty as something they could spend whenever they needed it. And worst of all, they expected me to thank them for the opportunity. As wedding planning entered its final stages, I made a decision that felt both heartbreaking and necessary. I stopped sharing details of my life with my family. I stopped discussing finances. I stopped answering every phone call. I stopped rushing to solve problems that weren't mine. For the first time in my life, I created boundaries. The reaction was immediate. My mother called repeatedly, leaving long voicemails filled with guilt and disappointment. She talked about how families were supposed to support each other. She talked about sacrifice and loyalty. She talked about everything except accountability. My father took a different approach. His messages became colder, more demanding, less emotional and more aggressive. He seemed personally offended that I no longer treated his requests like orders. Ryan, meanwhile, alternated between begging for help and accusing me of abandoning him. Every conversation followed the same pattern. It always started with sympathy and ended with entitlement. No matter how many times I explained that I could not continue funding his mistakes, he acted as though I were committing some terrible betrayal. One evening, about a month before the wedding, Ethan and I were reviewing final venue arrangements when my phone began vibrating again. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I considered ignoring it but eventually answered. The moment I said hello, she started crying. At first, I felt the familiar surge of concern that had controlled me for years. Then I remembered the fake storm damage, the stolen money, the lies. Suddenly, the tears didn't have the same effect. She claimed my father was facing another financial emergency. She claimed creditors were threatening legal action. She claimed the family could lose everything. As she spoke, I found myself listening differently than before. Instead of reacting emotionally, I paid attention to details. The story kept changing. Important facts were missing. The timeline didn't make sense. For the first time, I realized how often their emergencies relied on panic rather than evidence. When I calmly asked questions, she became frustrated. When I requested documentation, she became defensive. By the end of the call, she wasn't crying anymore. She was angry. The performance had failed, and neither of us pretended otherwise. After hanging up, I sat quietly for several minutes. Ethan looked at me and asked if I was okay. I told him everything. He listened carefully before saying something that stayed with me for a very long time. He said that healthy relationships don't collapse when someone sets a boundary. Manipulative relationships do. The simplicity of that statement hit me harder than I expected. Every major conflict I had experienced with my family seemed to begin the moment I stopped giving them what they wanted. Their love had always come with conditions. Their approval depended on obedience. The more I reflected on it, the clearer the pattern became. As the wedding drew closer, strange rumors started reaching me through relatives. Apparently, my parents were telling extended family members that Ethan was controlling me. They claimed he was isolating me from them. They suggested that I had become arrogant and materialistic since getting engaged. At first, the rumors upset me. Then they started making me laugh. The people spreading those stories had no idea what was really happening. They didn't know about the lies, the manipulation, or the stolen money. They only knew the version of events my parents wanted them to hear. I considered defending myself, but eventually decided against it. The people who truly cared about me already knew my character. The rest would believe whatever they wanted. 3 weeks before the wedding, another disturbing development occurred. One of Ryan's former friends contacted me privately. He told me that Ryan's financial problems were much worse than anyone realized. According to him, Ryan owed money to multiple people across several states. Some debts were tied to failed investments. Others involved gambling. A few involved individuals who were becoming increasingly aggressive about repayment. The friend sounded genuinely worried. He told me Ryan was becoming desperate and irrational. When I ended the call, an uncomfortable feeling settled in my stomach. For the first time, I began wondering whether my family's behavior wasn't just manipulative anymore. Maybe it was becoming dangerous. The closer we got to the wedding, the more intense everything became. Instead of celebrating, my family seemed obsessed with Ethan's money. Every conversation eventually returned to the same subject: how successful he was, how much his company was worth, how much his properties generated. They rarely asked about the marriage itself. They rarely asked if I was happy. Looking back, it was obvious they viewed the wedding differently than I did. To me, it represented the beginning of a new chapter. To them, it represented access to someone else's resources. A week before the ceremony, I received an invitation to dinner at my parents' house. Against my better judgment, I accepted. Part of me still hoped for reconciliation. Part of me still wanted the family I wished I had instead of the family I actually had. The dinner began politely enough. We talked about wedding logistics and relatives traveling into town. For a brief moment, things felt almost normal. Then my father brought up money. The shift was so predictable that it almost felt scripted. He started discussing financial opportunities, then investment possibilities, then expensive purchases. Eventually, he mentioned a luxury vehicle he had been looking at. Ryan immediately joined the conversation, talking about how successful families were supposed to help each other build wealth. I remember sitting there listening and realizing that neither of them had learned anything. Even after everything that had happened, they still viewed me as a pathway to Ethan's bank account. They weren't interested in repairing our relationship. They were interested in restoring their access. That dinner ended badly. Voices were raised. Accusations were exchanged. My father insisted I had changed. I told him I had finally started seeing things clearly. Ryan called me selfish. I reminded him that personal responsibility wasn't cruelty. My mother cried. My father yelled. Ryan stormed out. By the time Ethan and I left, I felt emotionally exhausted. During the drive home, neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Ethan reached over and took my hand. He asked me a simple question. Did I still want them at the wedding? I stared out the window for a long time before answering. The truthful answer was complicated. Part of me wanted to uninvite them. Another part still hoped they would somehow remember that they were my family. In the end, I chose to let them attend. It would become one of the biggest mistakes of my life. The final days before the ceremony passed in a blur of appointments, rehearsals, and last-minute planning. Friends and coworkers surrounded me with support. Everyone seemed excited. Everyone except my family. Every interaction with them felt tense. Forced. Uncomfortable. It was as if they were waiting for something, preparing for something. I couldn't explain it, but a sense of dread followed me everywhere. On the night before the wedding, I barely slept. I told myself it was normal bridal anxiety. I told myself every bride gets nervous. Deep down, however, another part of me suspected that something wasn't right. I just didn't know what. The next morning, sunlight filled the hotel's suite where my bridesmaids and I prepared for the ceremony. Makeup artists moved from chair to chair. Hairstylists rushed between appointments. Laughter echoed through the room. For a few precious hours, my worries disappeared. Looking in the mirror, I finally allowed myself to feel excited. I was marrying the man I loved. I was starting a new life. Whatever problems existed with my family could be dealt with later. Today was supposed to belong to Ethan and me. When I arrived at the venue, everything looked perfect. The flowers were beautiful. The decorations were elegant. Guests filled the seats. The atmosphere felt magical. As I walked down the aisle and saw Ethan waiting for me, nothing else mattered. Not the lies, not the betrayal, not the years of manipulation. For those few moments, there was only us. What I didn't know was that, while I was celebrating the happiest day of my life, my family was preparing for one final attempt to control me. They had already decided that if they couldn't manipulate me privately, they would confront me publicly. They believed the pressure of the wedding would force me to give in. They believed I would choose peace over confrontation. They believed I would sacrifice myself one last time to avoid embarrassment. They were wrong. And before the night was over, every single one of them was going to discover exactly how wrong they were. The ceremony ended beneath a sky so clear and beautiful that it almost felt unreal. As Ethan and I walked back down the aisle together, surrounded by applause, smiles, and the cheers of our friends and family, I remember thinking that maybe I had worried for nothing. Maybe the tension of the past few months was finally behind me. Maybe my family had chosen to put their resentment aside for one day and simply celebrate. Looking back now, I realize I wanted to believe that because the alternative was too painful. No daughter wants to accept that the people who raised her are incapable of being happy for her. No matter how much evidence exists, some small part of the heart keeps hoping. Mine certainly did. The reception began exactly as we had imagined. The ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected soft golden light across the room. Music filled the air. Guests laughed and mingled around beautifully decorated tables. The staff moved efficiently between groups carrying trays of food and champagne. Everywhere I looked, I saw happiness. Coworkers from the hospital were sharing stories. Friends from college were dancing. Relatives who hadn't seen each other in years were reconnecting. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely relaxed. Ethan stayed close to me throughout the evening, occasionally squeezing my hand or smiling whenever our eyes met. Every time he did, I felt reminded of why I had fought so hard to build a future away from the dysfunction that had defined so much of my past. Still, despite my efforts to focus on the celebration, I couldn't completely ignore my family. They were impossible to miss. My father spent most of the evening drinking heavily. My mother appeared unusually tense. Ryan seemed restless, constantly checking his phone and disappearing for long stretches of time before returning again. Whenever I looked in their direction, I noticed them whispering among themselves. At one point, I even caught my father staring at Ethan with an expression I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't pride. It wasn't admiration. It looked more like calculation. The sight sent an uncomfortable chill through me, but I pushed the feeling aside. I had spent too much of my life allowing them to ruin important moments. I refused to let them ruin this one. As dinner concluded and the dancing resumed, guests began approaching us individually to offer congratulations. The atmosphere remained joyful. Everything felt normal. Then, just after Ethan and I finished our first dance as husband and wife, I felt a hand gently touch my arm. I turned and found my mother standing beside me. She wore a smile that immediately made me uneasy. It wasn't warm. It wasn't genuine. It looked practiced. "Ava," she said softly, "your father wants to see you for a moment." I frowned. "About what?" "It's important. Can it wait?" She glanced toward the crowd before lowering her voice. "He wants to give you something privately. He doesn't want to make a scene." The irony of those words would become painfully clear later. For a few seconds, I considered refusing. Every instinct told me to stay exactly where I was. But then that familiar old weakness resurfaced. Hope. Hope that maybe my father wanted to apologize. Hope that maybe he finally understood how much damage he had caused. Hope that maybe he wanted to offer some small gesture of peace on my wedding day. I told Ethan I would be back in a few minutes and followed my mother across the ballroom. She led me through a side hallway near the service entrance. The further we walked, the quieter things became. The music faded into the background. The laughter disappeared. Eventually, we reached a private conference room attached to the venue. My mother opened the door and motioned for me to enter. The moment I stepped inside, my stomach sank. My father was standing near the far wall. Ryan was leaning against a table with his arms crossed. Neither looked happy. Neither looked emotional. Neither looked remotely interested in reconciliation. The second the door closed behind me, I realized I had made a mistake. A serious mistake. For several moments, nobody spoke. The room felt tense, heavy, uncomfortable. Then my father picked up a thick folder from the table and walked toward me. Without saying a word, he shoved it into my hands. Confused, I opened it. Inside were vehicle purchase documents. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw the price. Nearly $140,000. I looked up slowly. "What is this?" My father answered immediately. "The truck I've been wanting." I blinked. Surely I had misunderstood. "What?" "The dealership is holding it until Monday." I stared at him. He stared back, completely serious. No smile, no joke, nothing, just expectation. My heart began sinking deeper with every passing second. "You brought me in here because of a truck." My father crossed his arms. "No," he paused. "I brought you in here because your husband is going to help us buy it." For a moment, I genuinely thought I might laugh, not because it was funny, because it was so absurd, so disconnected from reality. After everything that had happened, after the lies, after the stolen money, after the manipulation, he still believed he could demand more. I looked toward my mother. She avoided eye contact. I looked toward Ryan. He smirked. That expression alone told me everything. This wasn't a spontaneous conversation. This was planned. Every detail had been discussed before I entered the room. My father stepped closer. "The down payment is $30,000. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. $30,000. On my wedding day, for a luxury vehicle. The sheer entitlement was breathtaking. I slowly closed the folder. "No!" The word left my mouth calmly, firmly, without hesitation. My father's expression darkened instantly. "No, no!" The room became silent. The answer clearly wasn't what he expected. Perhaps he thought the wedding would pressure me. Perhaps he believed I would agree simply to avoid conflict. Whatever he expected, it wasn't resistance. Ryan pushed himself away from the table. "Seriously?" I turned toward him. "Seriously?" He laughed bitterly. "Must be nice. What? Acting superior now?" There it was again, the familiar accusation. The one they always used whenever I refused to sacrifice myself. I was selfish. I was arrogant. I was ungrateful. Anything except honest. Anything except reasonable. My father pointed toward the folder. "Tell Ethan to write the check." "No," his jaw tightened. "I wasn't asking." For years that tone had worked. For years it had made me feel small. For years it had convinced me to surrender. But something had changed. I wasn't 12 anymore. I wasn't trapped in their house, and I certainly wasn't responsible for financing their lives. I met his stare without flinching. "Then the answer is still no." The reaction was immediate. Ryan exploded first. He accused me of abandoning my family. He accused me of forgetting where I came from. He accused me of choosing money over blood. Every accusation sounded more ridiculous than the last. The entire time, I simply listened. Because for the first time, I understood what was really happening. This wasn't about family. This wasn't about love. This wasn't even about money. It was about control. My refusal represented something they couldn't tolerate: independence. My mother finally joined the argument. Her voice shook with anger. She claimed I owed them. She reminded me of sacrifices they had made decades earlier. She listed every expense associated with raising a child as though parenthood had been a financial investment demanding repayment. Listening to her felt surreal. Not once did she mention my happiness. Not once did she mention the marriage. Not once did she acknowledge the lies they had told. The entire conversation revolved around what they wanted, what they deserved, what they expected. Eventually, I reached my limit. I opened the folder one final time, removed the purchase agreement, tore it directly down the middle, then again, and again. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The pieces drifted onto the floor between us. For a brief second, complete silence filled the room. Then my father's face transformed. The anger that appeared there was unlike anything I had ever seen before. His expression became cold, dangerous, almost unrecognizable. At that moment, I understood something that should have been obvious years earlier. People who are accustomed to controlling others rarely handle rejection well, especially when that rejection happens publicly, especially when it threatens their sense of power. I dropped the torn papers at his feet. Then I looked directly at all three of them. My father, my mother, my brother. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt absolutely no fear, only clarity, only certainty, only exhaustion. "I am done being your solution." The words hung in the air. Nobody answered. I turned toward the door. Behind me, I could hear someone breathing heavily. I didn't know whether it was my father or Ryan. I didn't care. All I wanted was to leave that room, to return to Ethan, to return to the people who actually loved me, to return to the celebration. I reached for the door handle, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. What I didn't know was that the most violent moment of my life was only seconds away. Behind me, something had finally snapped, and before I could make it back to the ballroom, my family's desperation would turn into something far more dangerous than manipulation. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The argument was finally over. For the first time in years, I had stood my ground without apologizing, without backing down, and without sacrificing my own happiness to keep someone else comfortable. All I wanted was to return to the ballroom, find Ethan, and put the entire conversation behind me. The music from the reception drifted faintly through the corridor ahead. I could hear laughter, conversations, and the sounds of people celebrating. It felt like another world compared to the tension I had just left behind. I took several steps forward, focusing on the ballroom doors at the far end of the hallway. Then I heard rapid footsteps behind me. At first, I didn't turn around. I assumed someone was simply leaving the room, but the footsteps grew louder, faster, more aggressive. Before I could react, I heard my father's voice explode behind me. "Ava!" There was something in his tone that instantly made my blood run cold. Pure rage, not disappointment, not frustration. Rage. I turned just as he reached me. Everything happened so quickly that my mind struggled to process it. 1 second I was walking toward the reception. The next, his hand slammed into my shoulder with enough force to send me stumbling sideways. My balance disappeared instantly. The heel of my shoe slipped against the polished floor. I collided hard with a decorative stone column positioned along the wall. Pain shot through my arm and shoulder. The impact knocked the air from my lungs. For a brief moment the world seemed to tilt. I heard shouting, I heard movement, but everything felt distant, unreal. When I looked up, my father was standing over me. His face was twisted with fury. Years later, what haunted me most wasn't the physical pain. It was the expression in his eyes. There was no concern, no regret, no hesitation. Only anger that I had dared tell him no. Behind him stood Ryan, and beside Ryan stood my mother. Neither looked shocked. Neither rushed to help me. Neither told my father to stop. Instead, they simply watched. That realization hurt more than the fall itself. The people who should have protected me were standing there like spectators. My father took another step toward me. Then the ballroom doors burst open. Everything changed. Several guests had apparently heard the shouting. A group emerged into the hallway at almost the exact moment my father advanced again. At the front of that group was Ethan. I will never forget the look on his face. Confusion, concern, then horror. His eyes moved from me on the floor to my father standing over me. The transformation was immediate. Every trace of confusion vanished. Within seconds, he was running toward us. The hallway erupted into chaos. People began shouting. Someone yelled for security. Another guest called 911. Several rushed toward me while others moved between Ethan and my father. The entire situation spiraled out of control. My father suddenly looked very different. The confidence that had fueled his anger moments earlier disappeared. Reality was catching up to him. There were witnesses now, lots of witnesses. People had seen enough to understand what had happened, and some had seen even more than that. One guest informed venue security that she had been walking toward the hallway when the confrontation started. She had pulled out her phone after hearing yelling. She had recorded part of the incident. At the time, none of us realized how important that recording would become. Ethan dropped to his knees beside me. His hands trembled as he checked for injuries. I remember him repeatedly asking whether I was okay. I remember trying to answer. I remember seeing fear in his eyes. The kind of fear you only see when someone you love gets hurt. For years, I had defended my family, made excuses for them, protected them. But in that moment, lying on the floor of my own wedding reception while my husband desperately tried to help me, something finally became undeniable. These people were not acting like family. They hadn't been acting like family for a very long time. Paramedics arrived quickly, although my injuries weren't life-threatening. The impact had left significant bruising across my shoulder and upper body. I was transported to a nearby hospital for evaluation. Ethan never left my side. Several friends accompanied us while the reception slowly dissolved behind us. The wedding everyone had spent months planning was effectively over. Instead of celebrating our first night as husband and wife, we spent it in an emergency room. Oddly enough, I didn't feel sadness. I felt clarity. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking whether I was overreacting. I stopped wondering whether I was being unfair. I stopped questioning my own memories. What happened in that hallway removed every doubt. The following morning, police contacted me. Because multiple witnesses had provided statements, an investigation was already underway. Security footage from the venue had been preserved. Witness accounts had been collected. The phone recording mentioned by one of the guests had also been submitted. My father initially claimed the entire incident had been an accident. The evidence disagreed. Witnesses described aggressive behavior. Witnesses described yelling. Witnesses described physical contact. And most importantly, none of their stories matched my father's version of events. The truth was beginning to surface. Unfortunately for my family, the wedding incident wasn't the only thing drawing attention. As investigators reviewed statements and gathered information, additional details emerged regarding Ryan's financial activities. Some of the people he owed money to had already filed complaints. Others had begun legal proceedings. Financial records, connected to several questionable transactions, started attracting scrutiny. What began as an assault investigation slowly expanded into something much larger. Weeks passed, then months. Subpoenas were issued. Bank records were examined. Financial documents were reviewed. Investigators uncovered a pattern that stretched back years. False stories used to obtain money, misrepresented financial emergencies, fraudulent claims, questionable transfers between accounts. Some transactions involved my parents. Others involved Ryan. The deeper authorities looked, the more they found. Meanwhile, my family tried everything. They attempted to contact me repeatedly. At first, they demanded loyalty. Then they demanded silence. Then they begged. The messages shifted dramatically once they realized the situation was serious. My father claimed the family was being destroyed. My mother cried and asked me to help. Ryan insisted everyone was overreacting. For the first time, however, their words had no effect. The guilt was gone. The fear was gone. The control was gone. I had spent years believing it was my responsibility to rescue them from consequences. Now I understood something important. Real love does not require self-destruction. Real loyalty does not require endless sacrifice. And protecting someone from accountability is not kindness. It is enabling. About a year after the wedding, the legal process finally reached its conclusion. The courtroom felt strangely quiet that day. My father looked older than I remembered. My mother seemed exhausted. Ryan looked defeated. For years, they had operated under the assumption that someone else would always fix things. Someone else would always pay. Someone else would always absorb the consequences. That assumption had finally failed. As I sat beside Ethan, listening to the proceedings, I felt no sense of victory. No excitement. No revenge. Only closure. The people sitting across the room had spent years manipulating me, lying to me, and exploiting my loyalty. Yet despite everything, I felt surprisingly calm, because they no longer controlled my future. When the hearing ended, Ethan squeezed my hand. We walked out of the courthouse together into the afternoon sunlight. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled and asked a simple question. "Ready to go home?" Home. The word carried a completely different meaning than it once had. For most of my life, I thought home was the place where my family lived. I was wrong. Home wasn't a building. It wasn't shared DNA. It wasn't obligation. Home was safety, trust, respect, love. Home was the person who stood beside you when everything fell apart. The person who never asked you to earn their affection. The person who protected your peace instead of destroying it. As Ethan and I walked toward the car, I realized something that would have seemed impossible a few years earlier. I wasn't leaving anything behind. I wasn't losing a family. I had already lost them long ago. What I was gaining was freedom. And for the first time in my entire life, freedom felt better than approval ever had. That was the day I finally stopped living for people who only loved me when I was useful. And the day I started living for myself.